My name is Annalee Davis, and this is White Creole Conversations, new ways of thinking about whiteness in a Caribbean context. And today I am with Katherine Felix Tafari. So, Katherine, just give me a little bit of an idea of what you're doing. I guess maybe it's important to say um, that you've kind of transplanted yourself to the Caribbean from somewhere
Okay.
else. So maybe start with that.
Okay. I was born in the States. I moved to St. Lucia in the Caribbean as a married woman. I married a St. Lucian in New York. We moved to South Carolina. From South Carolina, we moved to St. Lucia. We had two children at the time, my son Scott, my daughter Nikki, 8 and 4. So Nikki only knows growing up in the Caribbean from the time she was 4. Well, her memories of the States are very
Mm-hmm.
non-existent before
Mm-hmm.
she went there as an adult or a
Mm-hmm.
teenager. My son started school up into the second grade in the United States and then transplanted to St. Lucia and started in the school system in St. Lucia, which is all Catholic schools. I lived in St. Lucia, married to my husband for 4 years, and then as a single mom after we divorced.
Mm-hmm.
I lived there until 2007. So it's about 13, 14 years that I lived in St. Lucia as a white woman raising two brown children, and then moved to to Barbados in
Mm-hmm.
2007, and
Mm-hmm.
I've been here ever since.
And were you conscious of race in St. Lucia and in Barbados as a
Yes,
yeah,
constantly,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
In the States, I'd never been, until I lived in South Carolina, I've never really had any personal experiences. I was always taught that everybody was the same. My parents were very liberal and gave me an upbringing. I mean, my father's first way of telling me that people were different when I asked about who are those people over there walking on the other side of the bridge when we're going to school. Oh, they're chocolate, we're vanilla, but we're all the same. So my father was always very laughing it off
Mm-hmm.
and never encouraged me to get involved with stereotyping people based on race.
Mm-hmm.
My mother was a wannabe hippie. She was also one love and everything is all great. My background is extremely liberal, and I grew up accepting people for who they are and their actions. And I didn't really, I can't say I never saw people's colors, but it wasn't part of what made me decide whether or not my relationship was going further with you or how I was going to treat you. It was based on your treatment of me or other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my background before going to St. Lucia. In the Caribbean, is completely different. It's like slavery is in your face. You still see residue in people's behaviors. In St. Lucia, one of the biggest things that struck me was how quickly my daughter started talking about how why isn't her hair as good as her brother's, and that she came home and told me that I really like so and so, a young girl, but she's ugly. I'm like, what do you mean she's ugly? She's a beautiful little girl. Oh, but you don't see how black she is? And I'm like, this is my child. This is coming out of her mouth. My whole time in St. Lucia was spent with my children, trying to counteract a lot of the stereotypes that they are being fed from the society, because I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want them to believe some of the
Right.
things that they were picking up.
Right. Right.
And I've seen mothers tell their children that they call their children ugly. Come here, ugly. I'm like, why are you calling your child ugly? Oh, you don't see how dark they are. I want a pretty brown child, or their hair should be better. Race is very prevalent
Right.
in the Caribbean.
Right. Right. Okay. Um, so I guess maybe kind of leading on from that, I'm interested to learn what you if you think that Barbados or St. Lucia or the Caribbean feels like a very kind of racially ordered or segmented society, or if it's an integrated space, or if those things kind of happen simultaneously. Like, are there some areas that feel very segmented and some areas that feel more integrated? So, what does it feel like as a white person living in Barbados or St. Lucia?
Um, Definitely segregated. I think that there are changes. It's changing somewhat, I should say, and it's completely not changed, but there you can see that there is some changes, so some movement towards integration in different people, and I think it is in groups of people like artists.
Mm-hmm.
Artists are people who put aside differences anyway. We're very tolerant of differences. We embraced differences.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the artistic side of things, you see more integration. But I think in the whole in the Caribbean, you still see more managers, bosses, and business owners are white. The workers who get paid the least are black. The people who have opportunities for better education are white and brown skin and come from a better economic background. The poor families, and some in St. Lucia, when my daughter was going to school, I have a friend who tells me, oh, it's not like that anymore. But when my daughter was going to school, there was no provision for any kind of funds. So a lot of children were kept back from school.
Right.
Their parents didn't have money to give them to go and buy lunch or even money to go buy bread so that they could put something in a brown paper bag for them, or they didn't have money for school shoes or uniforms
Mm-hmm.
or books. So they would keep them back rather than send them without what they needed to do schoolwork.
Right. Right.
And those are all black families. Those are not white families. And I see a very different set of social circumstances in Barbados. There's more white people, number one. It's more common to see white people out in driving in cars even. It was a after living in St. Lucia for so long and hardly seeing a white face other than a tourist, to come into Barbados and you see everybody driving around and you see different families and you see a
Mm-hmm.
lot more white faces in so Barbadians on a whole are more tolerant towards white people. But in St. Lucia, there's a very obvious chip on a lot of people's shoulders.
Right.
There's a lot of hatred and resentment towards white people. Um, and at the same time, white tourists are sought after
Right.
and coddled to
Mm-hmm.
and made to be everybody sees them as the hope for the society
Right.
income wise, right?
Right.
So I've had instances in St. Lucia where I've walked into a bank and forgot my ID and the people cashed a check for me. They would never cash a check for anybody that was St. Lucian that walked in the bank and didn't
Right.
have their ID. It was because I'm white.
Right.
There's,
Right.
it's no
Yes.
other way. They trusted
Right.
me because I'm white.
Right.
So I've had good things, but I've also had a man follow me all the way from the car park all the way to the government buildings in St. Lucia, cursing me, telling me, go back home, you white people don't have any place here. And I mean, cursing me, stink, nasty, in my face. Like I was afraid that he was going to start hitting me
Right.
at any second had I given him any sort of reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, keep your head face and just get into the prime minister's office before this guy does anything. And
Wow.
everybody around pretended it wasn't happening.
Happening.
It's you're white and you're getting it, and
You deserve
yeah,
it.
you deserve
Yeah.
it, or we'll just
Yeah.
watch and see what happens.
Right. And then you were saying just before that there's some interesting ideas about notions around leadership that you've observed. Do you
Yeah.
want to say something about that?
Okay, since I'm from the States, my background growing up was always to believe that people had equal abilities. Is that some people may be better at one thing or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So I never saw that leadership was a trait that was corresponded to white or black or
Mm-hmm.
Spanish or anything else. I saw it as leadership was a quality that you developed or you were born with naturally. Um, my father encouraged me to be a leader. Um, and in the States, leadership never really occurred to me to follow a race line. When I moved down here, um, starting from being a manager, working my way up in a company to management level, I don't understand how many people came into the company that I work for after me, before me, and never went anywhere other than the job that they went into. I worked my tail off to take on more responsibility. I was always trying to elevate myself to a management level, which
Mm-hmm.
is where I left in the States. And I was sort of like starting from scratch in St. Lucia. So I was always trying to prove myself.
Mm-hmm.
But in consideration for positions like management, I would have been considered faster than any other black person there because of my skin color, not necessarily because of my
Capacity
ability.
or ability, right?
I mean, I like to think my ability is
Mm-hmm.
great, but
Right.
there's other people just as smart as me
Right.
that are born, raised St. Lucians, educated here and abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that they're not capable. It's that there's, I don't think they believe that they would be able to get the management positions. So they don't actually go after it. And people don't take
Right.
them seriously for those positions. Here in Barbados, when I first came here, the people who really ran the plant that I work for now are two black men. One of them was straight out of high school. He's never had another job in his life, and he's been there 20 years. There's not a part of the operation he didn't know about. And if 3 o'clock in the morning the press went down, he would be there. But he was being paid a very low salary. He was a supervisor, and when I brought it to the attention, when I came and I asked about it, why is Dave still at this level? They said, well, they can't afford to have him move up into a management position. He's serving the company best where
Where
he
he
is.
is.
Yeah, a white person would never be kept down in a job that he excelled at without being trained to continue to grow and take on more responsibilities.
Right.
Where a black man was seen as, well, just keep him right there because this is where we're useful. And the management is all white. And it wasn't like a deliberate prejudice. It is so ingrained that it was surprising to them for me to come and point out that, do you know that the rest of the company doesn't have any hope that they can ever be anything, because they see these people. Dave has been there for 20 years and can't get a promotion. How do you think that they ever feel like they have anything to aspire to? If you keep people down,
Right.
and it is such a rooted in history and colonialism and slavery, that it isn't even a conscious
Right.
prejudice. It isn't
Right.
something deliberate, like somebody is. I mean, if
Setting
I
out to
told
do
the
that.
managing director that he was prejudiced based on his behavior and selection of employees, he would be highly offended, hurt,
Right. Yeah.
that I would think that he is a prejudiced person.
Right.
But
Right.
from my perspective,
Yes.
he basically was choosing based on race,
Right.
but he never really sees it.
Right.
So there's those things.
Right. There's I guess a lack of self-awareness that maybe it's implicit and we're not even realizing ways
Right.
in which it's being played out.
And the other area where I wanted to mention in that discussion, that point, was all right. I'm an artist. I've been a writer, a poet all my life. So from the time I've reached Barbados, I've always kept in touch with what's going on in the art scene. And then I
Right.
went to a workshop that was put together by Mandy Cummings and Mark Jason Welch, that was poetry, but it took a lot of different local poets and spoken word artists, and being in one room and talking about poetry and life and the things that you talk about as a poet.
Mm-hmm.
So it became something that we wanted to continue. So I opened up my house, and we started just meeting, and it evolved into an informal social group. And it became the League of Extraordinary Poets.
Right.
And after a while, because I have a background in getting grant funds, I figured, well, if we formalize this, we can make this into something we can actually look for funding for doing events, and we could put on shows and maybe a festival one day. So all these things sound great, but they were all coming from me.
Right.
So I spoke to a member of the Black spoken word community, who is one of the most intelligent people I know, somebody I respect and care for very deeply, because he challenges a lot of my thinking, and I challenge his. But basically, we decided we would come together, but I took a back seat, and I wanted to make sure that from the beginning, it wasn't seen as a white woman coming into Barbados from outside and creating this environment.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back on it, the fact that I had to think that way is only because of the Caribbean context.
Right.
In the States, I would never have considered
about
that.
that,
No matter if you're going to do something, if you stand out because you're a leader, you stand out and you take credit. Or if you decided to take a background role, it's because of your personality and your choices. Maybe you're more comfortable with a background
But here
role.
it was loaded.
But here it was basically no matter which way I played it, if I was seen to be the front person for this group, it would have always been seen as this white woman who's come and taken, like, helped the poor black people.
Right.
Like,
Right.
you go to Africa and you help the poor black
Right.
people instead of
Right.
people being empowered and quite capable
Right.
of taking care of
Right.
themselves.
Yeah.
So the fact that after a while I wanted to step back and let people lead, I found that if I wasn't doing anything, nothing would happen.
Right.
And so there was this, I found myself in this catch-22. If I don't do anything, this organization, which was really positive and had a lot of things going on, and we ended up doing a show in Frank Collymore Hall. We've done a lot of things together that I'm really, really proud of. But I can't, it's like I feel like I can't take credit for it because it's, it would be it would be seen as, oh, of course you could do that because you're white. But these people, they could never have done it on their
Right,
own,
right.
which is entirely incorrect
Right.
as far as talent is concerned.
Right.
But as far as seeing yourself as somebody who owns a nonprofit that was going to
Right.
go out and help people
Right.
or go to the schools, most of these poets would not see themselves doing these things.
Right. Right.
So the vision of yourself is a lot of in the Caribbean is wrapped up in race.
Right.
And it's very difficult for people to come out of that vision that they have
Right.
of themselves that has been forced on
Right.
them
Right.
and that they've grown up with.
Yeah. Did you have an experience of growing up in a family that spoke about race at all? Did you kind of inherit ideas about whiteness, or I think some people feel like the ideas are implicit; they're not stated very clearly, but they understand what the rules are, and maybe there's not a lot of conversation. So, was there any discussion about race in your family, or because you were in a part of a majority, there wasn't maybe a need for it?
Actually, when my mother and father divorced, my father stayed in North Carolina. My mother took us to Chicago. We stayed with her gay brother and gay sister. I have all my life accepted them for who they are, and I have never been taught that, a gay person is somehow subhuman.
Right.
And I was never taught that way for people of different races or cultures. I was taught to, because my aunt is also an artist. My uncle's a writer, and they were very big influences on my development.
Mm-hmm.
And they've always had other people around. I've always been exposed to musicians and artists and crazy people that are just personalities, and had adult conversations from the time I was small. So my upbringing is probably very different from a normal white child because my upbringing was extremely unique.
Right.
But when she moved, when my mother got married, my stepfather moved us to Michigan, where he was an engineer and he got jobs there. In his second posting, he transferred. I can't remember what company he worked for, but he was transferred to a place in Michigan that was called the Twin Cities. One city was called St. Joseph and one was Benton Harbor. They bought a house, and it turned out that it was in the Benton Harbor School District. Well, the thing about these twin cities is that one was white and the other's black, and we bought land in the black side. So I ended up going to school, which was 98% black, and I was a minority in the high school that I went to. But I was not a minority like in the Caribbean. It was like you are aware that there's maybe only 5 or 6 white children in your class, freshman class or sophomore class. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't like you were constrained or restricted or felt strange or whatever. You basically, everybody just accepted everybody for who they are. But I grew up from that point. I became aware of music, culture that would be American black.
Right.
I went to my friend's house and danced to Motown. I integrated into an American black family and families, and my friends were all mixed. I had white friends, I had black friends. There was no distinction in my friendships and growing up. And then my father lived in South Carolina and North Carolina, so I went between the North and the South on a regular basis.
Right.
And eventually I ended up moving in with my father for about 2 years. I think that's all it lasted because I didn't get along very well with living in South Carolina. Visiting your father on summer vacation and going and playing with a horse is different. Going there and living and going to school is completely different.
Right.
And
Right.
and it is only when I lived in South Carolina in the States that I actually found myself talking to my father about race, because I never took it was just something you just take for granted, that some people are black and some are white and some are Spanish.
Right.
What's the big deal? Some are gay. It really never
Right.
reached my conscious thought until I moved to South Carolina as a ward of my father, who thought he was very
Open.
liberal. And the first time a black boy came to my house to visit me, and it was just a friendly thing, but my father became transformed into this person who didn't even know himself. And he admitted it later on. He says, I can't believe I felt that way, but I started thinking about how you would be treated if you dated this guy, and how you might die, and I'm worried about your safety, because I hear the people, I know what a white person thinks about a mixed marriage, and or even a dating relationship. And actually, I was asked to go to one of the proms or some school dance or something by a black guy, and I was told, no, under no condition can a black man and a white girl come to, and this is the school officials, and this was in the 1980s. Something I had never experienced before, and I was completely like aghast. But it is still, in the States, it's still that there is, I wouldn't say protection, but there's people understand it's wrong.
Right.
Even though they might covertly still conduct those behaviors or feel that way, or if they feel like they can get away with it without anybody seeing it, they will say the N word or curse somebody that they don't feel belongs.
Right.
All those things happen, but when I moved to the Caribbean, it was like being immersed back into slavery with the conditioning that I saw in people here. The black people who don't like their skin, that don't like their hair, that don't like their lips. And on a personal basis, it was really hard to see a lot of people that hated themselves.
Right.
And you understand from a historical context why it is.
Right.
But you still, it's like you want to shake people and say, wait, you're beautiful. Stop doing that. Stop saying that. And don't teach your children that, for God's sake.
Yes, no, of course.
And my own daughter coming and asking me why her hair isn't good.
Right.
I'm like, what do you mean not good? It's beautiful.
Yeah.
But no, you have to braid my hair. Look at Scott's hair. It's wavy and straight. How come I don't have hair like that? I'm like, well, that's the way you were made.
Yeah.
Accept it. It's beautiful.
Right.
Thank God now she accepts it. But
it
as
took a while.
As a 5 and 6-year-old, I had stress.
Okay, so kind of bringing it back to living here, can you identify things that make you feel that you don't belong in Barbadian society, or that you do belong into Barbadian society?
I feel somewhat at home in Barbados, but I think it's also because I've chosen not to take on board a lot of these, the things that I know people think. I really just don't let them affect my life. I live my life for me.
Right.
And for the people that are around me and know me, that's who I care about, and the opinions of society. If I really cared or tried to adapt my habits, I would be a crazy person. Yeah. I wouldn't have any fun in my life, and I'm not going to live like that. Some specific things I can tell you. In the Caribbean as a whole, as a white woman that doesn't speak with a Caribbean accent, the minute I go on a beach, a bar, or any environment like Oistins, or in St. Lucia they have Gros Islet or Anselray, I am seen as somebody that every nasty man who wants $1 from a white woman can come and accost. Right. And it is uncomfortable, and it makes things unpleasant. I don't want to go out by myself. Going out by myself as a white woman is totally unpleasant. Right. I go places where I know that the atmosphere or people that I know are going to be there. So it affects me in my socializing. Going to Aqua Beach. There's a friend of mine who owns a shop, a little cafe, a vegan cafe called The Good Life. Yeah. That's right across from Aqua Beach. A time me and Adrian were doing something. We were doing a spoken word piece, and we were discussing it. And we just started walking. We walked across the street, and actually we were just heading for the beach. The minute we crossed the highway, the kind of things that were coming out of people's mouths, I mean, you want this, you want that, you want a taxi. And it was like a constant barrage of these, here's a white woman, let me see what I can get. And he
Right.
was not, it was like he wasn't even there.
Yeah.
Because, oh, you're just
Yeah.
another black guy. You're probably trying to
Right.
get the same thing as me. And he was like totally turned off. I was like, could we just walk back to the cafe? Because this is not conducive to any kind of creative
No.
conversation.
Right.
And those things impinge on you.
Right.
And the guy that I married, he is a Rasta man. He is younger than me. And we fit such as appearance-wise, you look at us and you see this stereotype of a white woman and a Rasta man. Everybody thinks that I'm some visitor who just picked up this guy off the street. And if you let it get you, it would be hard. And I think there were years that it was really hard for me to go into a store with my daughter. I've gone to the hospital with my daughter and people ask me, so who are you to this girl? Because she's brown skin and I'm white, and she talks like a Caribbean child because she's always been in the Caribbean.
Right.
And I speak like whatever I speak like.
Right.
I'm kind of mixed.
Right. Yes. Yeah. There's an American accent with a strong Caribbean lilt.
While I feel at home in the physical environment of the Caribbean, and I have surrounded myself with friends that I feel at home with, and I think I have lived my life with integrity, so that I have made decisions that I'm not going to be a different person than who I am just for society's sake. So I think that I made my bed and I lie in it. I'm very happy here. But it isn't that I don't think about race. I'm not cognizant of how I look in the eyes of other people. But I can't, it's not like I blame them. I just wish things were different, that I wasn't perceived as something that I'm not.
Right.
Just because the man I'm next to has a different complexion than me, or that his hairstyle is locks and mine's straight, that a whole story is written about me every time somebody looks at me, that I can't, it would be a waste of my time and energy to try and to dispel these notions.
Right.
But just knowing it is hard to accept
Of
sometimes.
course. Yeah. Do you consciously try to distance yourself from being read as white, or do you distance yourself from other white Barbadians or white locals? Because obviously you've crossed this border of marrying somebody of another race. So is that something that you think about?
Every now and again.
Yeah.
But really, I have always judged people on how they interact with me. I have white friends, I have black friends, I have friends that are mixed. I have lots of friends that are mixed. I have friends that it's a white mother, a white husband, or like Roger in Indies from Guyana, and Roger is a local Bajan, white Bajan. So they are some of my closest friends, and they have a broad group of friends that are white Bajans, and they have mixed Bajans, and they have friends who are married that are like me, that have a different race in their partnership, and we all get along fine. But I wouldn't say I stay away from white people. I find that there is a very insular white community in both Barbados and St. Lucia that is not accepting or open to people like myself, who is not part of the white Barbados name. I just like people that drop names at me, and the first thing they do when they see me as a white person, they start telling me, oh, this family member and that family member and this, and they're dropping names. I recognize them, but they don't mean anything to me, because these are not people who have ever extended the hand of friendship to me. It's not that I don't feel like they're above or below me. It's just that there's a class thing that is not welcoming or warm towards white people that are not from Barbados. It's like I'm an outsider and I should stay an outsider, and whatever you do is fine, but you're not really a Bayesian. That's the impression I get.
Is there anything that you want to talk about in terms of, I don't know if maybe you feel you've covered it already, sense of pain or humiliation because of your race, or having experienced prejudice or racism?
Okay, I have experienced people treating me in a preferential way that I did not deserve because I'm white.
Mm-hmm.
I've gone into a jeweler here in town, walked up to the counter, and seen the cash register, the clerk, who was talking to another customer that was in there for I don't know how much longer before me, but obviously was being dealt with. And she left that person and came over to talk to me. And I'm like, well, you can finish with that customer there. Oh, no, that doesn't matter. I turned around and I walked out. I was really offended. I've seen that happen in a lot of different places.
Right.
And I told you earlier when we were talking that I've cashed a check without ID
Right.
in
So
St.
there's
Lucia.
privilege
And it's
that's
just,
being
yeah, it's like,
associated.
you
Yes.
know it's only because I'm white that
Right.
this happened.
Right.
And I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, experiencing the hatred of somebody, not based on anything you've done, but just because you are who you are. Um, I have been hit by a chain walking down the street in St. Lucia, like a gold chain, like somebody's necklace.
Okay, right.
Somebody just whipped me with it. When I turned around, I couldn't identify who because I'm in a crowd of people. But it was targeted. Then I've walked down the street and been paced step by step by a person shouting at me and telling me go home and calling me all sorts of things because I'm white. And they felt like I should not be allowed in that country, that I should just leave, and that everything that is white is bad. And the abuse I got from the time I parked my car to the time I got into the office that I was going to was excruciating.
Right.
And it was a verbal attack that I felt very threatened physically. Like if I would have answered him the way I really wanted to, I would have gotten killed or hurt in some way. So I was intimidated by this man's anger.
Right.
But there's hundreds of little incidents
Right.
that are all racially motivated by hate that I've experienced since being in the Caribbean,
Mm-hmm.
that I can only relate to what it must feel like being a black person in the States.
Mm-hmm.
In situations where, like, you're a black man walking down the street, you're automatically seen as a
Right.
threat.
Yeah.
And in the Caribbean, being a white woman, there's already
Yeah.
a perception of who you are,
Yeah.
and some of it is hatred. And I can't say that I don't understand where the basis of it is. Slavery was a horrible thing, and the resultant the riches being still with a minority of whites, jobs not being available. There's a lot of resentment
Right.
against whites especially in St. Lucia, where the population is not as educated to a higher degree. It's not that there's a lot of people that don't get the opportunity to go to school because their parents are poor. They get held back, they work on the farm, or if their parents
Right.
don't have enough money to send them to school, they keep them back that day,
Mm-hmm.
the next day, until they have money. So the children don't get the kind of education they would get like here in Barbados, where
Mm-hmm.
people are much better educated. I see that the level of tolerance is different. Like in St. Lucia, there's much less white people. So it is not common to see anybody who lives in St. Lucia as belonging there.
Right.
The white
Right.
community there is very insular. They don't go out and mingle with other people. They stay very much to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They socialize at each other's homes, or they have private parties at places where they're not going to get
Right.
riffraff
Right.
and black
Right.
people,
Right.
unless they are invited,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I was never invited.
to those parties.
Only if I had a proposal to write for somebody and they wanted me to come, yes. Other than that, no. Yes.
Well, I guess maybe my last question would be to think about how do we overcome, any ideas about how we overcome prejudice, or the kind of vision that you would have for Barbados in the future.
Oh God.
Like, how does that, what does that look like in terms of race, or and how are we working, or how are you working towards that, if that's something that you're interested in?
I think everybody should have some sort of interest in healing those rifts that are based in race in the past. I don't know. I think as an artist, I tend to write what I feel, or I create art what I feel, and I think that other artists do the same thing. But I think there's still a reluctance to deal directly with the subject of race, and maybe artists should start doing more of that. But then, if you're not playing on the radio just because you're being positive, imagine you want to attack the issue of race, you probably never get airplay. So
Right.
it's difficult to think about. But I think that the more people interact with each other, and that was one of the things that LXP was great at, is that we integrated a lot of different artists, and because I'm also a visual artist, I've met a lot of visual artists of all different backgrounds and ethnicities. That knowing these people and just starting to do events where people are brought in that everybody has an interest in, I think that would help. I really think, I believe in cultural exchange.
Right.
And just like I would believe that Japanese people would know more about Barbados if they came here, or Barbadians should go over there, and everybody would win because you grow when you
Right.
learn about another person's
Right.
culture. Is the same way when a group of artists get together. You interact with each other, you inspire each other, you give each other ideas. There's collaborations. I think that people to people
Right.
relationships is the only thing that will really change that. You In the States, they have a black president who's gone through all sorts of things, but he would never call himself a black man, or I never see him do that. He doesn't come out and say, "Ah, Black America, I'm the man with you." You know, he makes sure that he's for every person, which I understand, but at the same time, there's no voice for the black people other than when things erupt, and usually it erupts in violence. I don't want it to be like that here. The Caribbean should never get to that point.
Right.
But then, how do you begin that dynamic unless there's a group of concerned people that are willing to actually address it and think about it and talk about it? Which is why it's good that you're doing this,
Right.
because maybe it will spur some of those things.
Yeah.
But I really think that it's just knowing, accepting, and be tolerant of different peoples and what's important to them. The same way about religion and race and
Right.
all these things. It's only by getting to know individuals and getting
Right.
past what you see
Right.
that you really find out what it really is to be a white person who's transplanted from the U.S.
Right.
and lived in St. Lucia.
Right.
You don't know who I am really. If you just look at me when I'm walking in the grocery store with my new husband, you're gonna have a preconceived notion, which is completely irrelevant.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Any parting comments or?
I guess the only thing I didn't really talk about was raising two children who were mixed.
Biracial. Okay.
Both of them, I think, got a better upbringing in the Caribbean than they did in the States. They would have in the States if they had grown up there. I think that even though there is a lot of very more obvious prejudice here, not even prejudice, just awareness of color.
Right.
Even degrees of color here that you would never hear spoken about aloud in the States. My children wouldn't have learned about brown children and red children and white children.
Right.
That in St. Lucia, my children were referred to as white. They're brown. They are mixed. They are a combination. And I used to always have to tell my own children, but you're not white. You're mixed. You're special because you have everything. I think that maybe starting with school children,
Right.
and getting past some of those teachings that still come from the home out of ignorance, that black is not ugly. A lot of the younger people that I know that are artists, like in their 20s, they are playing around with natural hair. They are looking at how their appearance can be not Caucasianized,
Right.
but still be seen as beautiful.
Right.
And the awareness of their own beauty and their own history is becoming more prevalent, I think, in the generation of the 20s and 30s now in Black Barbados. I think they're a little bit still further behind in St. Lucia. In the States, it's all underground. It's not that it's not there. You have very, very vocal voices that stand out, but I think the majority of them are just basically laying low and not saying anything.
Right.
And it's something you don't talk about outside the house. But for children like mine, I would like a society that treats them just like everybody else, or
Right.
that everybody is equal.
Right.
But it's very difficult when you're trying to raise a child that comes from two different cultures and still trying to instill a love for themselves from both perspectives.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
how many people really deal with that in the Caribbean,
Right.
because there are, maybe it's a growing number of people that are mixed, but it is not as, because our
Typical.
population is smaller.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
not like you have a right, like it's not typical.
Yeah.
Like I'm not a
Yeah.
typical person going to the grocery store with
Right.
my husband and his 3-year-old, and everybody looks at, is that her daughter?
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah.
it's I think that people have to be aware that race isn't really a choice.
Right. Exactly.
You are who you are because
Right.
of genetics and
Right.
circumstances.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's, you know, one of the pieces that I'm most well known for was called Who I Am. And I've had so many people walk up to me and say that they relate to that piece. And it was written from me as a white woman in a Caribbean world, and I get tired of people prejudging me because of my
Right.
skin color.
Yeah.
But I've had black people come up and tell me, I mean, tears in their eyes, saying that piece touched them so much, because people assume that they're just like every other black person.
Right.
So it isn't that
Yeah.
prejudice is not different dependent upon who's on the receiving end. It feels just as bad no matter
Right.
who it is.
Exactly.
So if we don't all learn how to share love and compassion for everybody, regardless of our exteriors,
Yeah.
we've got a long way to go.
Yeah. I think so.
But yeah, that's where
Good.
I would like to go with it.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for
No
joining the
problem.
conversation. I appreciate it.